Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church, to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting.
Welcome back to the Gottesdienst crowd. This is Jason Braaten. Today we have back with us Adam Koontz. Welcome back, Adam.
Hey, how are you?
Great. It's good to have you back.
Yeah, it's good to be here. It's been a while, and I'm still waiting for that check in the mail, but thanks for having me back.
Well, I must have gotten lost. I'll have to check the accountant.
I think it just always does. It's so weird.
Yeah. So you gave a paper in Missouri on the order of creation and the first use of the law. So what is the gist of what you presented to the folks down there?
I talked about the orders of creation, and I'm stressing the plural there on orders, and I'll explain why. But I talked about the orders of creation because they are the way that God has set the world up to function. Obviously, it does not function ideally because sin and death have their say for now. But those orders, and the one that usually we talk about, and that the reason that it's usually a singular order of creation, which is the relationship between man and woman. When people talk about it today, in addition to that, you can talk about family, you can talk about the state, you can talk about time, and that's one that I talked about a fair bit in that presentation. But I talked about it in relationship to the first use of the law, which generally gets skipped over as the curb. So if you run up on the curb, it'll hurt your car, and that's kind of where we leave it. Because, in a nutshell, I think that's actually, when we talk about things going south in our society, in our country, what is dysfunctional, what is not working generally in our lives, I'm a friend of the third use of the law, but very often we're not even talking about the third use. We're not talking about guiding Christians in good works so that they avoid useless works, right? That's part of it, and that's most often part of it for people who were Roman Catholic or evangelical. When they become Lutheran, now they don't have to do X and Y and Z, because those works aren't commanded by God. And instead, here are the good works that God has laid out for you. That's actually the third use. The first use is the sheer, rather obvious connection between actions and consequences that nonetheless is the one I think most often under assault, both in our lives personally and then generally in our society. So an example of that would be, this is not the third use to say, look, if you keep the father and the mother and the kids together in the same house in a marriage that endures until death, things will work better. This will be better. The son will be less lost if he has his dad around. The daughter will have a better sense of how to be in a marriage herself if she can see mom and dad working together well, right? That's not the third use, right? And I think sometimes when we talk in Lutheran circles, and I'm just doing inside baseball, just guessing what your audience is, but when we talk in Lutheran circles about we're debating the third use, I think a lot of times what's actually behind that is a disagreement on not whether the first use of the law should be preached or something. I think it's a disagreement in an assessment or maybe even in something less articulate, maybe just a sense of how things are going and what is going on. And that's the reason that I most often find that the people who are most concerned about the proclamation of the law, the understanding of the law, or in a more extended way, the orders of creation, they're almost always our laymen who have no professional jargon stake in opposing the proclamation of the law, right? They've never been told this is such a problem, right? And then otherwise, it'll be a parish pastor, because we encounter day after day after day after day the decay of normal life, and I think this is first use stuff, but the decay of normal life in our members' lives. Right. So I'm not going to, I mean, even if I wake up and I'm the most fervently antinomian person, just by reflex, I don't mean theologically, just by reflex. And Pastor Braaten could attest that, I'm not personally that interested in having somebody tell me what to do. So I have my emotional sympathies with antinomianism.
Yeah.
Not convictions, but sympathies. But I mean, if somebody's marriage is falling apart, right, because they simply don't know how to live with another human being, because they were kind of raised to be antisocial, they were raised by media, whatever, or they were raised to believe that the husband and the wife need to be at each other's throats all the time, or it's not real, or something, or if they don't feel a certain way, it's not real, and they can't stay in the marriage. It doesn't matter what my sympathies are. And we're not even quite talking about the guidance of Christians and good works. We're talking about basic infrastructure for life and how they need to align their lives with those things. And that's what the orders of creation are, just in a nutshell. And I think that it operates through the first use. And what's happening a lot of times today is that it's simply not operating. Right? People are not being curbed, because they don't even know where the curb is. They're driving on the sidewalk. They're smashing into plate glass windows in the storefronts. And they're like, that's just fine. This is normal. This is the way life is,
So it's the use of the law that curbs the mostly peaceful protests.
Yeah. I mean, it curbs the protest, but it also just curbs me from being, like if you think about ways that different societies put this into practice, this would be something like manners, right? Where, the kid, I just give you a really practical example. Whenever my folks are in town, they're visiting, and so they want to take us out to eat. So we go out to eat, and, the server, the look in the eyes is always the same. It doesn't matter where we are in the country, different restaurant, whatever. They see 8 kids coming in and they're just terrified. They're just really worried about what's going to happen here, but whatever, it's a free country, and the Supreme Court said that, you can't discriminate. And so that's good for me. Right. So they can't just turn me away because I have 8 kids, right? Categorically, they could, oh, well, we don't have room, or, the little guy is not wearing a collared shirt. Depends on the restaurant, right? But generally, they have to take us. They got to make some. I'm gonna be a paying customer, and they're just terrified. And I understand, because they're very worried that my kids are just gonna like wreck the restaurant and scream for like the next hour. And because I see other people's kids, and it's not everybody, but they just don't know. They just don't really have manners, right? They're kind of like little tyrants, and their parents are exhausted all the time, and taking them out to eat is a giant chore, and then they behave horribly. So things like having or not having manners, like, well, you're in a public place, you can't just scream. You need to wait your turn. You need to say, please. Please, may I have a refill, right? These kinds of things. None of that is rocket science. It's not in Ephesians anywhere. This is just the way that we agree, that we work out. Different societies work out over time. How are we going to live inside of these curbs that God has set up? Like, we can't all talk at the same time. When that kind of stuff breaks down, I think sometimes pastors don't know what to do about it, because, and I think I said this in the presentation, it's not strictly speaking our job. Right? Like, I can't discipline somebody else's kid. Even, it doesn't matter if they're all my members. I can't discipline their kids for them. I could say, like, if the kid like jumps in front of me at a picnic, I can be like, you need to wait your turn. But that's not, I'm not raising this child. And so I think one difficulty that we have here is, well, we're not quite sure what to say. And you definitely don't want to say more than the Word of God says. So I'm not offering a class in manners at the church or something. But I think it is pertinent when we do need to explain, as we do with, say, premarital counseling. That's probably one of the better examples of a remnant of describing the orders of creation in a way that is helpful to people, this is the way it's going to go, right? You marry this person, you marry this person's family. Again, that's not the third use. That's a description of how creation is set up, that people come from families. And when two families are joined in a marriage, the man and the woman are joined, but they bring all that stuff from those families with them, good, bad, indifferent, right? So this is something where, especially for pastors, I think it is fruitful to think about these things, because this is where people live life. They don't live life in the service. That's a small fraction. Most of their life is lived inside. This guy who's older than me at work is acting this way. How do I relate to him? This guy who's younger than me at work is doing this or saying this. How is that different? Why is that different? Is it different? What about my parents who are getting older? Whatever, right? This is where people live. And when it's disordered, we all kind of pay the price in various ways.
Yeah, it sounds like this is kind of like Titus 1 and 2, the older men and the older women helping and training the younger men and the younger women. But it's beyond that as well, because it seems like you have a particular order that is set by what happens at church, and that order is meant to bleed into the family, but also into society in general. So when it breaks down, how is it restored? What are the things that a pastor can actually do? I mean, I've had conversations with people whose children are rowdy in church to say, well, let's see what you're doing at home. Like, how are you instilling kind of a disciplined life at home so that this carries over into church as well as into society or school or wherever?
Yeah. I mean, all of these things are related, and the idea that they are meant to be separate, or that you can separate the way that life is ordered or disordered from one another is wrong in anyone's experience. I mean, if the family life is bad, then that will bleed into work. If the work life is bad, that will be very readily brought home and affect the home. So none of this is really separable, even if we wanted to, right? Even if we wanted to strictly compartmentalize, it's nearly impossible to do. And when we do it, we put ourselves under enormous amounts of strain. Okay, so when you're thinking about something like Titus 1 and 2, for example, the disorder that is going on there, I think you kind of have to read the opposites of the positive admonitions of Paul. When you read the opposites, you realize that disorder usually, not only, I mean, just bookmark, it's easy to do, but the disorder will always produce a lack of duty in that person, because when you slide into disorder, you also slide into self-satisfaction, right? So, for instance, if the older men are not behaving in that way, and notice that the older men and the older women, they actually have different, this would maybe now is described as like a time of life or a season of life. That is part of the order of creation is time. Like time's time's only evil under conditions of sin, but something that is a great blessing of time is that by God's grace, we gain wisdom over time. So the older men and the older women not only comport themselves differently, but also they have different gifts to bring to the table than the younger saints who are, like the younger ladies in Titus 2, they're busy with their children, right? And so the older women are actually helping them with those things, teaching them the kind of things that they learned in their own lives when those were actively busier at home. So the orders of creation, when we're attentive to them, we acknowledge that they're there. Like I cannot be right now what an older man is because God hasn't given me those years yet.
Right.
But he can give me things because God has given him those years. This is, I mean, I think especially with respect to time and age, this is difficult for us to fathom because we worship eternal youth. And this is not just a problem for the young where they become haughty, like they think that the the older saints or the elderly as a group have nothing to teach them. That really is sort of a perennial problem. I mean, if you look at Rehoboam, right? He talks to the old guys when he comes to the throne, Solomon's son. Rehoboam talks to the old guys. Old guys say, don't go so hard on people,
right?
Like just chill. Paraphrase. I'm not.
And then he goes harder.
Yeah. Well, he talks to the young guys, and the young guys are like, "Look, if you want to get anything done, you got to go hard. You can't, right? They're right out of college, they're right out of seminary, right, and they're gonna fix it. So the young guys are gonna go hard, and he goes hard, and everybody's like, I hate you, and interestingly, from that time, that fissure that's been there in Israel the whole time. If you go back even before David, the writer, right, whoever that is, Joshua, 1 Samuel, the writer kind of marks Israel and Judah separately. Mm-hmm. But it's really from Rehoboam ignoring the older guys that Israel and Judah split apart in that moment, right? And Judah stays with their own. Blood really is thicker than water. That's an order of creation. But they're not going to come back together after that. Every time before, when they went in different directions, they came back together eventually, right? There was even a war already between Israel and Judah, right? In order for David to come to the throne, but they came back together. After Rehoboam's foolishness, they're not coming back together. They go their separate ways. And then that's going to harden into two different kingdoms, but they've already gone their separate ways as of that moment. When the orders of creation are disregarded, you don't realize that God is giving particular gifts to an older woman that a younger woman doesn't have, an older man that a younger man doesn't have, or that a younger man is given a kind of energy to get things done that the older man has not been given. His energy has slowed down. He doesn't need to be active. I mean, and if you look at Israel is, kind of, you're ready to go at 20 in public life, right? You're ready to go. You're ready to serve, whatever. And you are slowing down. If I want to say off the top of my head, it's like 55, 60, if you're like a priest or a Levite. So when that's happening, you need to realize each of these seasons for your own life has its own duties and it has its own gifts. And when you think about it that way, that really, I think, alters the way that you look at life, because this is something, I don't know if we've talked about it. I've talked about it in other places. I am one of the least anti-boomer millennials there is out there in the world. Okay. I'm anti-Gen X. That's my edgy take. I'm anti.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. You guys don't do anything. No, but one of the least anti-boomer, but I do think that the difficulty that the boomer generation has, all of us after them also have, which is for a variety of reasons. I think they don't know how to get old. They don't know how to be old, right? Which is something that happens to everybody, right? And there are gonna be exceptions to things like this, because some people are born like at 800 years old, like myself. Like I've been old since I was 2, but a generational difficulty that each generation, however much stock you want to place in that way of categorizing people, that each generation has, is that we have all been worshiping youth. So we don't know how to be old, because, and you can see this in all kinds of things, but notably, I think culturally, one thing you'll notice is that when boomers were kids, their parents would go out and do things that only adults could do. They would go to like adult supper clubs, right? Adult, dances they would dress up.
Right.
Everybody just dresses like a kid now. We're all just wearing shorts and Crocs, like the simplest thing. Right. And so this is, I'm not like old man complaining about it. I'm observing we don't really have things for adults that don't just involve like drinking alcohol. That's reserved for adults, right? Officially. But the issue here is that you need to be able to be the various ages that you are. Like when you're a kid, you can run everywhere if you want to. Like it's not that weird. When you're an adult, you're supposed to have a certain dignity the kid doesn't have. When you're older, you're supposed to have things to pass on that even the younger man does not have. So it's being able to move through these times, and that's an attitude toward God's, we might say, architecture of the world that is accepting it as a gift.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that whether you're talking about age or whether you're talking about marriage, you're talking about the opposite sex, you're talking about whatever, the orders of creation, yes, they have duties inside of them, but because God's order is good, we don't experience them as sheer demanding burden.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they are, right? I mean, sometimes they are full of afflictions and crosses, but we also experience them. And I think anybody that has children or grandchildren, this is readily evident from life as it is from Psalm 127, Psalm 128, is that, I have duties toward my children, but my overwhelming sense of them, right? Father's Day is coming up as we record this. I don't know when it'll release, but it's coming up. My overwhelming sense on like Father's Day is like, this is just an incredible gift. Like, I feel like somebody gave me, 8 $10 million checks. That's how I feel about them.
Yeah.
It's not, I'm not like, oh, do I have to have my kid? Do I have to have kids? But see how people are taught to think of them as sheer burden. And I think that's, whether that's inside the church or whether that's outside the church, it's evident that when children are thought of as sheer burden or something, you're dealing with a situation where it's like, God has set it up this way, but I'm going to interpret that as, like the guy that got the 1 talent. I knew you were harsh and you reap where you don't sow. I knew it. So I'm going to handle your gifts in this ungrateful way.
So God is not some sort of cosmic killjoy, just trying to, make you hurt in every possible way.
Yeah.
And obviously we can often chafe under God's order. But you're giving us a picture here of kind of this life of human flourishing that the order of creation gives us. This is good. How do you then restore that, not just within Christians to see this, but how do you how do you begin to convince the society, the state, to say, like, here are manners and this is good?
Okay. Yeah. For Christians, their understanding of who God is, as well as his orders of creation, or what he has laid out for us to do, that the good things that he has made for us to do in Christ Jesus, that we should walk in them. The faith is increased through the gospel. It's not going to be increased through being like, you need to be, to me, this feels rhetorically obvious, but let's just say it is. Obviously, if you run around, and this is why I try not to do this, if you run around being like, you need to have more kids, you need to accept them as a gift, obviously it's not gonna be a gift, right? Like,
right.
You're just gonna get miserable people who feel like they are checking off all the boxes, like, on some sort of inspection checklist. Faith comes through the gospel. If God reveals in the gospel that he loves mankind so utterly and so deeply that he would give his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life, then what else does such a God give? Right? Like, if you can't read Jesus can look at the birds and what are essentially, little wildflowers in the field, and say, look, if he does it this way, what will he not give those whom he loves and is remaking in his image according to his only begotten Son? Like, what else besides will he not give? And that's the connection between creation and redemption that people love in Paul Gerhardt's hymns. But then so rarely is that connection made for them also in the sermon, also in the teaching, also in the, here's how your daily life and the fact that the sun came up today relates to this God whom you know through the gospel to be, the fathers would say philanthropos, a lover of mankind, right? A lover of mankind, a friend to men, right? I have not called you servants, but I have called you friends. If that's the God that we're talking about, then of course other things that he has given us, which ends up being everything, right? Paul says, "What do you have that you have not received?" Of course, that's going to be an experience also of his unutterable love. It will not always be so clear as the gospel is. That's why we don't rely on it. I don't rely on, he's given me this now, so he must love me, right? But when I see it through the gospel, when the overwhelming reality of my life is the gospel, then all the rest besides, right, feels like maybe the stuff spilling out at the top when he gives me good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, right? So for Christians, it's all going to proceed out of the blood of Christ, right? For the state, to whom we don't speak in that way, I think they need to understand that, and sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, right? They need to understand that you can't really run a society off, let's maximize certain destructive personal freedoms and see where we go with that, right? So in the sense that I can't necessarily rely on, when I have a public interaction with somebody, that there's going to be there's like a certain code for how this goes so that we can like live in peace with each other, which is basically just what manners are doing. Manners are there, and they vary, right? They vary across the country. This is, this is a large part of the differences between the regions, is that the manners vary, right? Based on history and people and everything. The manners vary, but there's something in place anywhere so that life can be carried on in a decent fashion day after day after day. When that doesn't exist, but increasingly anywhere I go, I can obtain cannabis, I can bet on sports, I can gamble on sports, I can gamble probably in lots of other ways too, on lots of other things. If I'm maximizing those things that maybe are fun, and that's all legal, but I have no expectation, and the state can't police whether people look you in the eye or say thank you.
Right.
But the state needs to realize it has an interest in the kinds of human beings we have and what they're learning. One way to know that is to see how and why the public education system, now much derided, justly derided, but what the public education system used to be interested in. And one way to see this is to go see, you can see descriptions of school in something like Farmer Boy, but you could look at McGuffey's readers. This is, it used to be so common. Americans could just walk up to each other and just start saying something from the fifth McGuffey's reader, and the other, person who had gone to like 8th grade could just pick up from that paragraph. Right. Henry Ford would do this with people to see if he liked them because he loved McGuffey's readers so much. So, right, is that what does a McGuffey's reader inculcate? Well, yeah, you're learning to read, you're learning different grammatical concepts, you're learning, but what you're really learning is like, when you are cheated, do not cheat in return. Right. You're learning essentially mores and manners. This is how you do. Here is how untrustworthy people deal with other human beings. Right? Is that it was there, that education system was there to inculcate not just opinions, but also ways of being, because the state had an obvious interest in having certain kinds of people who would be, for instance, whether in business or in their family life, trustworthy, because that would make for peace.
Yeah.
That would make for the orderly functioning of daily life.
So how does the faithful pastor then, actually take these things up, even though some of it is not actually his calling?
I think, let's start with something like kind of tactical, and then maybe we can talk about the strategy of this. One tactic that I find particularly helpful to people is that when I teach the catechism to completely new people, okay, or if I'm teaching the 10 Commandments in a Lenten sermon series or something, that never gets divorced from the very first thing in the small catechism, doesn't get divorced from one of the last, if not, depends on your edition, one of the last or the last thing, which is the table of duties. That the law is not just there to show you what to do, specific to being a Christian. And it's not just there to accuse you of sin. It is there to do both those things. But it's also there just to point out to you, here's what has been set up, right? I think that when we skip over the first use, what we skip over is basically here's the way the building was designed. So it's like we learn how we're failing to build parts of the building, and we learn, and maybe the pastor is like haranguing us with how we're supposed to be doing better at building parts of the building. But if I don't have the big picture, it's kind of hard to say, like, why am I doing this? And it's always, but when I'm covering the first use, I cover it at the outset, and then now by the time I get to the table of duties, I can bring the 10 Commandments back in and say, see how this fits in, see how this has to do with, like, not speaking ill or whatever, right? Is that this isn't just there arbitrarily to make you feel bad or arbitrarily to give you stuff to do. It's there because the marriage is going to work better, for example, when you don't go yakking to everyone else about all of your worst takes on your spouse's conduct. Okay. So the 8th commandment also plays into the 6th commandment and to honoring the marriage. All of this stuff fits together because God set it up to be that way. And here's what he set up, right? And so when they have that, then they have a much better sense of, okay, this is why we're doing this. Or if I try to step outside this order, let's say I try to rebuke an older guy, right? Try to step outside this order, I should expect it to go much worse, whether I'm right or wrong, than if the guy's the same age I am or is younger. I should just expect that, even though that older guy might be, the way I describe, I think, all generations in modern America, as basically uncomfortable with getting older. Like, just will not accept the process. And I don't mean like you need to like sit there and enjoy the fact that it's taking you longer to get out of bed. I don't mean that part. Like, having gray hair, the Bible says that's a good thing. Right. That's a sign you're not the fool you used to be, and that I, at my age, still am. Right. But you're trying to hide it, or you're like ashamed of it, or you're like, well, I'm just an old guy, right? So these are things that tactically can tie you into, please explain why it fits together this way. Explain how the commandments aren't just arbitrary. They're not just like a poster that OSHA made you put up in the break room and nobody reads it. But you could get in trouble, right? Right. That's not what they're set up for, because strategically pastors need to take up explaining why things are set up this way, because particularly the society around your people, even if you're kind of sheltered vocationally from that, you're not really, but I mean, maybe you feel that way sometimes. If you're sheltered, your people encounter no reinforcement that is productive, hardly ever, for those orders of creation. This obviously applies to marriage, but it also applies to how they raise their kids, or how they do or don't discipline their kids, or how they treat their aged parents, or lots of things. Yeah. Right. So if you don't give them a sense of what it is and why it matters, that's not going to be supplied by, their Disney Plus subscription.
Yeah. Do you think that, before you get to the larger strategy stuff, do you think that some of this is just assumed by clergy today, that they do know it and thus it's not? Or do you think that the clergy themselves are struggling to put it together?
Well, both.
Okay.
Yeah, both. Because yeah, there's assumption, and this is part of like generational misunderstanding. So I just give an example of this. My I don't know about Mrs. Braaten. Mrs. Koontz does not wear like a head covering when she goes to church, right? On top, besides her hair, right?
Right.
Okay.
Same with Lauren.
Right. Full disclosure, right? To anyone who doesn't know me. Okay. But there are plenty of ladies who are trying to wear head coverings or are wearing head coverings and that's fine. I could go kind of either way on that exegetically out of 1 Corinthians 11. Whatever. I'm sure it'll get decided and then I can be burned at the stake if necessary later on. It's totally fine. I'm not worried about it.
Yeah. But, I'll lead the charge.
Great. I mean, the charge, whatever you need to do to take me down, it's fine. I'm waiting for it. But older generations in the church, however conservative they imagine themselves to be, often react very allergically to women wearing head coverings in the Lutheran Church. Maybe for all kinds of reasons. I think part of that is whatever 1 Corinthians 11 means and 2 through 16 maybe. Whatever you think that means, you need to understand that the reason that women are trying to wear head coverings now and that the men are wearing beards is because there are men with beards wearing dresses. Mm-hmm. That's why it's coming up. That's why people are looking at it. That's why. Right. Yeah. And so, and this is why I don't usually like the generational strife thing, because what I think it does is that it shuts down the process of sympathy and understanding between generations that should exist in the body of Christ, in families, in places where we are meant to understand each other and then to, from whatever position God has put us in, whether it's authority, whether it's obedience, whether it's older, whether it's younger, whatever it is, that we would sympathize with and seek to understand the other person's perspective. So if the older person doesn't feel as, stringent about the question of head coverings or something as I do or as somebody does, that's fine. He doesn't therefore get off the hook from thinking, okay, this person, her whole life has been told not just that she's in various ways superior to men, but that also in addition to that, and totally contradictorily, men and women are just on a spectrum of expression. Okay, so both those things she's been taught, and now she reads the Bible and she's like, oh, men and women are different. And this is actually a good thing. And I should learn how to be a woman because I'm a woman, right? Whatever. Isolate that audio if you would, please. Please. Somebody will, I'm sure. But and so the reason that whether you think she's right or wrong about what she's doing in worship on the basis of what she understands 1 Corinthians 11 to be, she's doing that because she's living in a different world than you were raised in. Mm-hmm. Because if there are major differences between generations, it's because our society changes so rapidly. And that creates chasms that I don't think it's the church's business to reinforce in any way. But I think it is our business to understand that they're there so that we can, if possible, if God gives us the grace to do so, that we can overcome those chasms by understanding one another and then saying, okay, I am not going to behave like the world is exactly the same. And I see where you're coming from. And obviously I also, as a Christian, however old I might be, I understand men and women are different. This is expressed, and it needs to be expressed and it needs to be lived, because if we don't, we can't assume that will just be taken care of. Okay. Mm-hmm. And that's what we have assumed. The clergy also struggle with those things. Just to return to the other facet of your question, the clergy also struggle with these things because we have often thought of our job as completely isolated to the proclamation of the gospel, strictly speaking. Mm. And then everything else was just more or less explicit. Or if we needed to bring up the law, and you can notice this even grammatically in people's sermons, is that when they're just doing accusation, right? And the law, it might not be the case that for the Christian, the law only ever accuses, but it is the case that's how it comes up in the pastor's sermon. Is that grammatically what you'll notice is that it often takes the form of something like a harangue rather than explanation, which has various ways that the Holy Ghost can apply that to people's hearts. I should have done this differently. I didn't, right? Second use, right? That's helpful. I never thought of it that way. Maybe third use, maybe first, right? But grammatically, it takes the form of a harangue, or he sort of acts like what he's saying is obvious. And if he visits specific issues, he visits them very briefly to mention them. Or he will even begin to accuse you of things that are just, like, well, I've never been in a position to do something that evil. Okay? Like, I deserve to go to hell on the basis of my sin, but I didn't do that. But the reason he's doing that, or the reason that he's speaking that way, just grammatically, right? Harangue, rhetorical question, blah, 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 blah. The reason he's doing that is because he's assuming I have the amount of information I should have, but I just don't feel guilty about it. And so this is actually a deficit in our preaching of the law. I don't think a lot of people know why we're yelling at them. That's set aside the question, should you be haranguing the people of God that way all the time? Like, I don't mean like revealing that they're sinners. I mean haranguing them, talking like that to them, talking down to them. Okay. But the other question is, do people know what the law, has this ever been laid out for them? And I would say in a lot of cases, 7 out of 8 cases where the person, especially an older person, says, I don't know what happened, Pastor. My kids don't go to church. My grandkids aren't even baptized, whatever. I don't know what happened. Is that there's a lot going on there with the orders of creation, how Christianity was or wasn't explained as fitting into the rest of life for that kid, and certainly for those grandkids. It's not like it's all bulletproof, but there's often a little bit more to say and a little bit more explanation that could be offered to, I don't know what happened. I mean, our Lutheran fathers would immediately start to talk about education, for example. There's a little bit more to say, and there's a little bit more light that could be shed on the situation. But if you're busy just like haranguing the person, I don't think anyone ever explained to them, look, if your kids get educated not to care about church, guess what's going to happen in most cases when they're older? Like, right. But I don't think that was ever talked through. A lot of this was just never explained,
Yeah. So there's a failure on two fronts, right? That this is what the people are experiencing, but the pastors are suffering from themselves and trying to, as you say, harangue, use the law by volume and duration instead of instead of really as a mirror, as a description of, I mean, you could describe what is good and then ask, is this what you have done? What does God do in the garden when Adam and Eve have fallen? He doesn't harangue them. He asks them questions, doesn't he?
Yeah, right. And that lets them connect the dots, or something that I like to do, because you're already standing above them just architecturally in the church, right? But I never want to come off like, I figured this out. So if you just listen to me, is that like an example of this is a lot of guys are trying to save, Thomas the Apostle from some sort of ignominy that some generation of preachers threw him into. Apparently there were harangues against Thomas. So now there are anti-Thomas harangues. This is a great question, whatever. Like, no, it's not. Thomas is being a jerk. I don't think the solution is to just harangue back because you don't like how the first harangue came off. It's to say, and this is how I try not to, put myself anywhere above God's people. I mean, far be it from me. We all have stupid questions. We all have demands of God. that he's under no compunction to meet. Look at how gracious he is with Thomas. How gracious do you think he's going to be with you? Because I don't I don't experience the orders of creation or the exposition of God's law as some sort of, this is why you're doing a great job. But I do see them as enlightening and helpful. And I think if you explain it like it is enlightening and helpful, it will indeed be enlightening and helpful to God's people, because I think a lot of times nobody has just ever laid that out. Mm-hmm. And this isn't just a matter of biblical illiteracy. This is a matter of what is the ministry actually there to do? Even if the person is reading his Bible day in and day out more than you do, Pastor, it's still helpful to have somebody else connect dots for you that you would not otherwise connect. And that's what the pastor is doing, no matter how much the people are reading their Bibles.
Right.
And so when those dots are connected and you say, well, take a look, right? So for instance, coming up as we record this, I'm going to preach on Genesis 15. So Abram is asking questions and he's like, this isn't panning out. This is who's going to take everything when I die, if I die right now. Is that God is going to comfort Abram with that promise, but then Sarai is going to have a workaround. I have this girl, she's Egyptian, I think she can have kids, blah, 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 blah. You guys all know the story. Well, you're trying to work around the order. God ordered this so that the kids are going to come out of the marriage. And he actually, for this man and woman, specifically came and promised that he would give the gift of children to that marriage. And they're still like, not so sure. So when you run into something like that, I don't want to talk about that like, well, and I figured it out because I only ever have any kids from the marriage, like, good for me. Like that's not the point of such preaching. The point of such preaching is to show how and why, in addition to those special promises for this couple, how and why he put sex, marriage, and kids together. Right?
Yeah.
Why are these things together? They're not just there to like make you feel bad if you pulled that apart in a way that wound up in the same predictable way that Sarai wound up feeling about Hagar. He put them together because it's good that way, and here's why it's good, and here's why you want to go in that direction. So I think that there should also always, whatever the Holy Spirit is doing in application to the people's hearts as you're preaching, I think you always want to talk about these things with humility, because it's not like you set it up this way, so you don't like get credit for it. So if you come off in your teaching on these things like, let me show you, but if you come off as, let me show you how wonderfully he's done this, I think that's always a good thing. That's always beneficial to people. They're always helped by that. They can always see better what is God's wisdom.
So it sounds like besides that part of the strategy is just to explain things in this helpful and enlightening without haranguing them way. What other strategies?
That's right. No harangue. I think also that you don't presume that they know things that maybe you yourself, maybe you have like forgotten the timeline. You yourself didn't know until relatively recently, or you yourself didn't know until you were studying theology for a living or whatever. So a lack of assumption without a shred of condescension, just saying, in your instruction, in your preaching, that here's how this fits together. Here's how this works. Okay. This is why it is this way. Okay. And not some other way, because like I said, I'm not sure they've ever heard it. In addition to that, with no pedantry whatsoever, because that's just tiresome. And it sounds then in your preaching of the law like you are high and mighty, which the Lord himself doesn't sound like when he preaches.
Right.
So the Lord himself, is like, I am gentle and lowly of heart, right? But some pastors are like, I am high and mighty. That's how they sound when they talk. So without a shred of that, right? But that you say like there, and this is a trope in the scriptures, as it is also in very early Christian writing, probably most famously the Didache, which may or may not date to the time of the New Testament, depending on whom you're following in your ideas. There is that you talk about these things, whether it's a moral choice, whether it's a marriage, whether it's a work problem, whatever it is, that you actually address everyday life, and that you address it very often in terms of two ways, that good and evil lie before you, and that the choice of good is not just a sheer arbitrary, like, well, I'm just doing this because God told me to. Sometimes that's enough. That's fine, right? That's plenty. You don't actually need more than that. Why should you pray? Because God said so. Good, right? But that why should you pray, or why should you act this way at work, even though it's going to mean less compensation? Because here is how God set up life to be prioritized in the case of work. And yeah, you could stay more, or you could go on more trips, or whatever your colleagues are doing who don't have a family to take care of. But here are things of lasting value. The precise amount of compensation is not one of them.
Yeah.
Okay? And here's why. Because here's a story about a guy who was really rich and then he died, right? So there are various ways to do this, but that you're constantly setting before them the structure of God's creation, evident in that creation, such that we can know his power and divinity, but even more than that, explicated in the scriptures so that we understand what is of value and what is not, what is not just right, but good and beautiful, and what is not, right? That the structure of these things, the order of these things. And it's interesting that when the Lutherans first started using the phrase orders of creation in the 19th century, I think, and I said this in the lecture, when a lot of order that had been taken for granted in public as well as private life was falling apart, particularly in Europe, especially in the revolutionary era between the French Revolution and 1848 particularly. When that stuff's falling apart, the Lutherans don't just talk about this as orders of creation, like them's the rules. They say the Creator's orders. So here's how he has organized the garden, right? He put these flowers next to each other. He put these trees to give shade to this kind of ground cover. This is the way that the master has ordered things, and it's good. And when people understand that, that is very powerful for them, because then they begin to see his wisdom displayed in life.
So it's like Bob Ross being involved in his painting. We're going to put a little tree here.
I don't think that Jesus has an afro quite on that level, or maybe at all, right? But I mean, whatever.
The demeanor.
Yeah, the demeanor. I think a certain happiness.
Yeah,
is right, and you see that. I mean, the church has a temptation to grimness that is evident in the disciples being like, he doesn't have time for kids, like, get out of here. And Jesus doesn't just take up the little kid because infant baptism is okay. That is part of it, right? That's good. I'm fine with that, right? That's great. Like, he does it because children are maybe the best example that anyone experiences in this life of just enjoying being alive, which is what we would do if we accepted the orders of creation. You can just enjoy being alive, right? And we do that at times, but we lose the capacity when we distance ourselves from these things. We lose that capacity usually the more life we have. It's an irony, right? The more gifts he gives, the more prone we are to ingratitude. The kid is just happy that like the grass is wet right now and his feet are getting wet and it's fun, right? Mm-hmm. We usually lose that capacity. And so putting the child in the midst and saying, this is how you enter the kingdom, right? I mean, this is my second favorite scare book, next to Discourses in Matthew, is his doctoral dissertation on infant faith, because you can actually see everything else kind of unfold out of that book if you're willing to follow it. And he dropped all the references to 19th century German theological debates. But what you can see unfold is like the model for receiving the life that Christ brings is the model of one who is new to life. Right? You're going to receive this like a brephos, like a little child, a little one, and you just take it all in. You just take it all in.
So something to be explored and have an adventure on, not something.
Yeah. Right. And I mean, like, example being when the order of creation gets discussed in the Missouri Synod, and you can go look the term up, and I'm sure, like, you could go on the CTCR website and use the specific search term order of creation. It's always to respond to a problem. We don't know if the ladies are supposed to be voting. What do we do? We don't know if the ladies are, and it's usually like, what are ladies not allowed to do? We don't know if the ladies are supposed to be doing this or that or the other thing. I don't know. Maybe we have, right? I'm not an expert on the history of the CTCR. Do we ever talk about this? Like, just to say like women are so great. Like, they're wonderful. They're amazing. What are they like? What are some examples? Is there a CTCR document on the grace of Abigail in handling the situation with her crazy husband Nabal, and he's just like, flipping out about everything, and she manages that situation, and like David and his men don't, burn down their possessions or whatever they're about to do because those guys are kind of wild and lawless themselves. Mm-hmm. I mean, we don't have that. We don't do that. We're just like, well, what's the problem? So, when you come at God's creation that way, of course you're missing so much, because it's like the only plant you can identify as poison ivy because you're worried about getting some poison ivy on your wrist or something.
Yeah.
Like, you don't know anything else. You don't know the maple, you don't know the beech tree, you don't know the oak tree, you don't know any of this. You don't know when anything flowers. You just know, oh, this poison ivy, stay away from it.
And you're just looking down the whole time.
Yeah, you miss it, and you want to get out as soon as you can. You're not going to go back in the woods. You're scared. Mm-hmm. You're scared of it. You can't enjoy it. You're not enjoying it. You just want to get out as soon as you possibly can. Please stop asking questions because it makes me nervous, right? So I think when you think about the creation that way, or you think about male and female that way, you think about marriage that way, you think about age that way, you think about children that way, of course we're not going to talk about this. We're not going to be like, oh, what are the Creator's orders? Like, how did he lay it out? Right? What grows in the understory of the forest underneath the beech tree that gets so high, right? We're not interested in that stuff because we don't have this joy in experiencing life that he gives that the child does.
Yeah.
That the child has, unless we crush it in him,
Yeah, we don't even get that when we're driving anymore because we're just watching the GPS.
Speak for yourself. I'm still printing out directions from MapQuest.
Okay.
And I'm just enjoying. I'm enjoying every minute of it.
Yeah, I try to go without as much as possible, but usually when I get into a foreign city, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to pull this thing out because it is pretty handy.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, but I mean, being lost is only, it's a matter of perspective. So, it's. I think the ability to just enjoy life as a gift is what you're given with an appreciation of the orders of creation. Without that, you're always kicking against his structure, his architecture. And maybe you don't know it, right? You don't know what it is that you're trying to push against, and therefore why it's impossible to overturn. But when you know what it is, much less when you just kind of accept it. Because, I mean, this is not all cognitive stuff. I mean, you can experience the joy of having children without reading Psalm 128. But when you both experience and you grasp from his word what these things are, it's just more fun. I mean, I don't want to sound superficial, but it's just more fun to be alive, because you're like, wow, this is just great. I can't believe how good he is, right? And then I think it makes more sense when you're in the Sermon on the Mount. You're like, why is he talking about sparrows? I can't even tell what a sparrow is as opposed to a chimney swift, because I don't know anything about creation, because I just know poison ivy. You know what I mean? But you're like, oh, this is why he's talking about sparrows, because the whole thing is just amazing the way he set it up.
So it sounds like there needs to be a kind of resurgence or a way to tap in and help people regain their imagination.
Yeah. I think imagination is part of this. I think also connecting, let's say, parts of theology that haven't often spoken to each other. So, for example, I would say, like in the Sermon on the Mount, the discussion of sparrows, birds generally has connections to the way that birds are talked about in the Old Testament. So you have biblical studies or exegesis, but that should also be connected to things that we talk about when we are trying to convince somebody of the truth of Christianity, because we might talk about design, evidence for design. What kind of flight pathway does a certain bird follow in the the Mississippi flyway, right, through the heart of the heartland? Why does he go that way, and where does he go, and where does he winter, and where does he summer, and where does he have his babies, right? We don't really connect those things as often as we should, because creation, as far as what it is, how it pertains to us, but also how it pertains to everything else, is kind of unknown to us. We talk about it as a fact, and then we kind of go quickly from the first article to, but you're really screwed up, et cetera. If you even long after you have become a Christian, keep exploring these things, then you'll find that in terms of the creed, the articles are vastly more interconnected with each other. It's one God.
Yeah.
Right? The articles are vastly more related to each other than I ever understood. And so now the sparrow is reminding me of the gospel, and the gospel is reminding me of the sparrow.
So it's not just imagination, but also a curiosity about things.
Yeah, right. And the willingness to explore these things. And that's why you can do almost anything with somebody who is willing to explore. But someone who already knows everything, I mean, it's just impossible. Not that, I mean, I'm not speaking of any Lutheran whatsoever who already knows everything. But when you have somebody who is not yet a Christian, if he's curious, and I say, well, why is it like that? Like, why does your kid look like you? How does that work? Where do you think that comes from? Why is that? And if he wants to just put the ceiling at, well, that's just how genetics works. I'm like, well, why? You're not very scientific, because you don't keep asking questions. You just want to download the answers, and now you get to be right about everything, right? Is that curiosity, an imagination to explore things, but also the curiosity that spurs exploration, allows you to begin to appreciate things for what they are, rather than being angry that they're not otherwise.
So go ahead.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that is also how, let's say, ethics connects to what we would describe as dogmatics, right? Is that if I truly understand what the gospel is, if I'm going to therefore nurture rage against any other creature of God, then I'm not sure that I quite have grasped the nature of the gospel, the gravity of my sin, or the work and the graciousness of that work that Christ has done on my behalf, that I might have eternal life. But now I'm going to turn around, right? I mean, this is the unforgiving servant. I'm going to turn around and nurture a much greater wrath for much less cause, right?
Yeah.
So all of these things are always connected. When we disconnect them, we make it difficult for our people to understand, for instance, how is my child's education connected to my child's understanding of the gospel? How is the way that I treat my husband connected to my understanding of what God's word is? Those connections are much easier to draw when I reintegrate the article of creation and the orders that creation has back into all of my thinking.
So how do we tap into our people's imagination and spur them on to curiosity in how we preach?
Yeah. I mean, Netflix does it all the time. So it's not as hard as maybe we think it is. Movies do it all the time. Right. So two different things here, right? Number one is, if we're not trying to outdo Hollywood, we don't understand what our real competitors are. Our competitors, sometimes it's a non-denom church. Sometimes for a kid that usually needs better social skills, it's the Eastern Orthodox Church. So we need to know what's the matter with the non-denom church. What's the matter with the Eastern Orthodox Church? Sure, whatever, right? But for the vast majority of our people, they depart into the lands that Netflix has laid out for them. They think the things that their education told them to think. Okay. If I can't present the truths of God's word in a clear manner, in a way appropriate to the moving nature of, to use the example from earlier, a man who is worried about what's going to happen to his family after he dies because he doesn't have enough family and he doesn't have the family God promised him. If I can't present those things with the beauty, the seriousness, the clarity, the whatever that text has, then I shouldn't be doing this for a living. I need to try to face my actual competitors who are presenting to our people all kinds of different visions of what life is for and what men are supposed to be and whatever other topics that God's word also takes up. So I want to try to be better than Hollywood screenwriters. That doesn't mean that I will be, but it means that I am putting my all into it because the souls are worth it, right? Don't be lazy. These are eternal souls. So why can't you put your best stuff out there all the time? Why do you have to act like, the liturgy is there to cover up the inadequacies of your sermon? It's not. If you're not going to be lazy at the one, don't be lazy at the other, Yeah. Because number two, the people have imaginations, and it doesn't matter like what their affect is, or are they expressive people or they're not expressive people? Are they would never clap ever under any circumstances, or they might clap if like something, caught a hold of them and, swept them off their feet. Right. We're not talking about the emotional setting of your people, but that realize that when Jesus explains the truths of his resurrection to the Emmaus disciples, he's opening their minds to understand the scriptures. That the grasp of the truths of scripture is a process of openness and opening for sinners. It's not a process of, I've heard this before. You're not bringing novelties to bear, but you're showing things in a light or with a set of connections or whatever the case might be that they haven't quite thought of before. They haven't thought of in a long time, or they didn't realize, or they didn't see how Abraham's story was connected to their own story. Right. And when that happens, that is when their imagination is engaged the same way that it has always been engaged by, for our people, largely visual media, right? Movies, TV, TikTok, right? Whatever else, that through the words that God has given you to proclaim, that they are engaged, right? All of them, including their emotions, their imagination, and not only, but in addition to their cognition, their just grasp of things.
Yeah. So to talk about where we came from, in terms of this seeking to open their minds to these good truths that God has put into place, do we have touchstones within society still that we can point them to, like manners and things of that nature, that that help them to see this order?
Yeah, because it's not like because certain things have gone away, life has just become sheer absolute incessant chaos for everyone everywhere.
Right. So,
I think that when you're talking about something that is in fact structural, the order of superior force that generally keeps the evil from doing whatever they want, whenever and wherever they want. Mm-hmm. When you're talking about something that's structural, I think it's generally most convincing to people to sort of lean up against it rather than describe it exhaustively. So I don't need to say, when I'm trying to explain, let's say Genesis 9, I don't need to explain the nature of vengeance. And explaining the nature of vengeance is generally less moving to people than saying something like, God, not only in the law of Moses, but also in our daily lives, puts people in a place to carry out righteous vengeance. And if you want to do it that way, if you want to say it propositionally, like I just did, you can do that. In addition to which, you could use a Bible story of righteous vengeance. You could also talk about the way that the reason that you are obsessed with detective shows is because when innocent blood is spilled, you want to know what happened, and you want to make sure that it doesn't happen again, and that this person doesn't get to just walk off scot-free with this having happened, right? Yeah. So you can appeal very readily all the time to things that they're well acquainted with, because, and this is why, none of this needs to come off as like, it was better in my day. Here's what's wrong with kids today. Is that part of God's gifts is that they're continual. So it's not like all order has disappeared. It's not like all men and all women are gone because some people are confused. It's not like all innocence in childhood has evaporated from everyone, right? These things are still available, and you can appeal to them, whether it's in shows they watch, whether it's in the lives they live, whether it's in, and this is where knowing them is so helpful, because you know what to appeal to. You know what moves them. You know what they know. You know the things that they're into. You know the general shape their lives have, whether people always move away from that town, or some people stay, or everybody stays, or whatever, or everybody moves in, whatever the case may be. You know those things. And so you can appeal to the way that God's orders manifest themselves in their lives, or the ways that they usually don't.
I wonder too if, we don't notice the windshield until there's a bug on it. And
yeah.
And I wonder too if we can point to something to the effect of, like 99% of your day goes according to God's plan and order, and that's a good thing. But you notice the 1% that's gone wrong or that has offended you, and not that you shouldn't notice, but that you shouldn't let it rule over you.
I think that when you're talking about orders, you need to realize that ingratitude will be the rule unless you are otherwise not just taught, but spurred on and encouraged to exercise thanksgiving. Thanksgiving comes up, right, as all good gifts are to be received with thanksgiving and prayer. This is the one who gives every good and perfect gift. Things
it's Romans 1.
Yeah, right.
Like that distinguishes the Christian from the pagan.
Yeah, is that ingratitude is the name of the game, and that obviously, just the way life is set up, the ingratitude is almost never, just in terms of the amount of time we have in our lives, ingratitude for like the preaching of the Bible or the sacrament of Holy Communion. 99% of your life is lived with gratitude or ingratitude for the fact that your car started, gratitude or ingratitude for the fact that the sun rose, gratitude or ingratitude for the fact that your wife exists, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that I think is key to understand, that unless I'm constantly encouraged toward Thanksgiving, thanklessness will be the default for the windshield for anything that's protecting me and that's making life possible and that's actually wonderful. And if I didn't have it, I'd miss it right away. But I've never not had it, so I don't miss it, and I'm just ungrateful. But it's still there nonetheless, right?
Is there a sense in which, because I mean, I'm older than you, but even, I have grown up in a time where we've always had indoor plumbing. I've grown up in a time when
I didn't.
Yeah. I'm not that old.
Okay. I didn't know. I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, indoor plumbing is not that old. I mean, in the scheme of things, right? What, the last
No, it's not.
70, 80, maybe 100 years?
Yeah.
So in terms of like technological advances, that's a huge, huge advance.
Right.
And, there are still people who worship at my church who remember when they didn't have indoor plumbing
Right.
or electricity everywhere. I mean, there was electricity, but not in all the farmhouses.
They didn't have it. Right. Yep.
Yeah. And so is there a sense in which we don't even know what has been bequeathed to us by the people who have gone before us?
Yeah. I mean, that has to do with an ingratitude for age.
Yeah.
That whereas in the Bible, it's not just that the aged are to be honored, but also that the past is determinative of the present. Very obvious. Why do you live here? Well, this is because this is the land of Naphtali, and I'm in the tribe of Naphtali.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the villages that we got. And here's where it says it in Joshua. When things are just more arbitrary,
Mm-hmm.
up for determination by my salary and the job prospects that the Chamber of Commerce has cobbled together for me in this town, or not, then life is going to seem more arbitrary, and it will be harder, not impossible, but harder for me to realize that life is not arbitrary.
Mm-hmm.
That God is ordering not only providentially, but also structurally. So he's providing for me moment by moment providence, but he has also ordered life in such a way, orders of creation, that it will serve good things and it will redound to my good when I live in those good things, rather than the other evils I might choose or seek or slip into. So when I think about it that way, then I can accept particularly the experience of the aged and the life that they have built up as a wonderful thing. If the aged don't know how to be aged, they don't know how to offer their wisdom, or they think that they're irrelevant, or they think that the job of their life was to accumulate as much money as possible before they die, and good luck to their kids, instead of sharing wealth through generations, which is the way that Proverbs is always talking about. The legacy that a man can possibly, by God's grace, leave to his children. If we don't know how to be young and they don't know how to be aged, then neither is benefiting from what God has given to each of us in each of us.
Yeah. So any final thoughts to wrap up? I know we've gone kind of long here.
No worries. I think that if we can recover the understanding that the orders of creation are not just there when we have a problem or when we're trying to figure out what girls are allowed to do, or here's why boys shouldn't play on girls' sports teams or something, but that we understand that this is just structure, and that the structure is really from such a kind Father, is an incredible gift that we will obtain a sense of life, of being alive, and of being renewed by his Spirit for life, that is very deeply joyful rather than harsh, miserable, certainly out of tune with the one who said, "I am gentle and lowly of heart." And that we will find in him rest for our souls. I think in understanding what his gifts are and the multitude of his gifts, we do find a rest that is available nowhere else.
Well, thank you for your time and for all these insights. This has been really quite a joy to dive into the first use of the law and the orders of creation and begin to rethink how we talk about God's order and how we can open the minds and the imaginations of the people who are listening to the Word of God so that they're not chafing under it, but rejoicing in it. So thanks again.
Right. Yeah, thank you. It's been my pleasure.